In 1993, I had Ron Paul sign my copy of Freedom Under Siege. He probably doesn't remember that, but he did do that. And I followed him 1996 and onward at a time when I wasn't following politics at all. I mean, really, 1996, Bill Clinton versus Bob Dole. I mean, the establishment must have gotten a good laugh about that one, right? I mean, there's a big old choice, right? In fact, wasn't that a great Simpsons episode, right, where the aliens come down and they're dressed up as Bob Dole and Bill Clinton, and they're drones, and people say, oh, they're really aliens, and they say, but you must vote for one of us. And someone objects, I'll vote for a third party. And one of the drones says, don't throw your vote away. Oh. Well, ladies and gentlemen, from 1996 to 1998 and 2000, I wasn't following politics, but I was following Ron Paul just to see if he won. I would tune in, I'd go to the internet, I'd find out, did he win his race? And I wasn't even keeping up with what his activities were. Somehow I felt better knowing he was there. My favorite Ron Paul anecdote, and there are many of them, but my favorite one is that Ron Paul was speaking before an Arab American group. And they asked him beforehand, have you prepared a special speech for our group? And he said very revealingly, no, it's the same speech I give everywhere. And this stunned them because they were expecting him to come give some pandering speech just for them. But his view was, no, I think freedom and individual rights are a pretty good idea for, everybody. He has voted alone no in the House of Representatives more than all other congressmen put together. The late Kent Snyder, campaign manager for the presidential campaign, actually wrote as his master's thesis a study of Ron Paul's lone votes when he was the sole no vote. And he did an analysis of it, and of course he found a consistent thread of principle throughout. I have a copy of this, and I don't know how we'd go about permissions or something, but it would be wonderful to see this distributed because it makes very interesting reading. Ron Paul gets attacked by moral and intellectual pygmies and always remains the dignified gentleman he is. And it is a great honor for me right now to introduce to you Congressman Ron Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that very nice reception. I don't know, is there a whole lot to say after you listen to the judge? Isn't he great? Earlier tonight, somebody came up and a young person introduced themselves, and they said they wanted to go into radio and maybe be a radio announcer or talk show host. I thought, that is great. But I get a question all the time. A lot of young people come to my office. A lot of them will be targeted for, how do you get into politics? I want to get into politics. And they'll say, what do you do? And their inquiry is more like, how do you work up the ranks? Do you run for state rep? You do this? How do you raise money? And all the technicalities. And I really tell them, don't do that. If your goal is to be in politics, just forget it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be involved, but that shouldn't be your goal. It should be secondary. And I give them a little talk about learning and education and discovering Austrian economics and all these things. But I also tell them that what you're going to end up doing is not like what I'm going to do. Just think of the diversity of the things that have. I mean, being on the television and having a radio talk show, you can reach a lot of people. You can have a bully pulpit. So I would say that the judge certainly has done his duty in getting our message out. And there's no way to know what your job is going to be, but I really believe strongly in understanding the issues. I didn't have much interest in politics in college, and I meet so many young people now, teenagers and college kids, and they come into the office, they come to our meetings, and I figure you're way ahead of where I was at that time. And in college, I never went to a political meeting. I think there were 2 days when I had a political concern when I was in college. I had remembered World War II and the end of World War II, remembered Korea and the end of Korea. No, it hasn't ended yet. I forgot about that. But it was in 1956, and maybe some of you know exactly what the political event of 1956, and it had to do with the Suez Canal. The taking over the Suez Canal, and the British and the French went in there, and they were not going to give up the Suez Canal to the Egyptians. And it wasn't going well, so they went to Eisenhower and said, come in here and rescue us. And when that announcement was made, that's when my ears perked up, because I knew there was a draft in World War II, and I knew there was a draft in Korea. I said, I'm going to get drafted, you know, and called into this. Fortunately, Eisenhower said, no way, I won't have anything to do with it. But my concerns were justified about being drafted. A few years later, it wasn't that many years later, by 1962, in the Cuban crisis, the missile crisis, that is when they drafted me. I had finished my medical school, and I was a medical resident up at the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, and got my draft noticed. And when I talked to my veteran friends at home, you know, of course, I'm a veteran. You know, and then they identify, and politically that isn't harmful. But then I tell them that I was a volunteer. Oh, you actually volunteered to go in? And I said, yeah, but let me qualify that, because I got this draft notice, and it said, you're drafted as a buck private in the U.S. Army. Unless you want to volunteer, then you can be a captain and be a doctor and practice medicine. So I said, I volunteered. Today, now, I'm not so sure that was the wisest choice in the world. There are some others that have stood up to, participating, but that's a different matter, and that has to do with civil disobedience. But there'll be a chance for everybody to make their own decisions in which way you will contribute. But the most important thing is to understand the issues. I figure the education I got from my public school education and from my college, which was not public, it was private, that it took a good many years to unlearn those things that were beat into my head that they told me were factual. So it took a while to get rid of them. I had a young man call me this week, and we talked for a good while. I think he was from Florida. And he said he was 24, and I asked him if he was in college. He said no, he didn't go on to school. And I assured him that wasn't the worst thing in the world. I said, some people take a long time to get rid of that. Some people are inclined to get an education or, an official education. But everybody has to be educated, and sometimes you have degrees and you're not educated. And that's what I think is part of the freedom movement and part of the campaign for liberty, is we talk a lot about education, understanding our history, understanding civil liberties, and understanding our foreign policy. And that means understand it by educating oneself and reading and knowing why we believe in the things that we do. And this will allow you then to have the kind of job that is really going to be beneficial. This week we weren't scheduled to be in Washington. This was the week that we were supposed to be in our district doing our district work. And last week, we were supposed to be up here voting, but anybody was paying any attention, there was a little snowfall here last week, sort of stirred things up. And so our votes were canceled last week. And people were, delighted about that. They were saying, Congress is not in session. And you know the old story that you're safe as long as the legislature's not in session. But the whole thing is is, I don't believe that anymore. I think government is on autopilot, and no matter where we are, Congress is in many ways irrelevant because they have given up all their prerogatives. The Congress is supposed to be the most important body of the government, and now it's the least important. The judicial system writes the laws and throws out laws, and they do the legislation. Think of the executive branch of what they do. They have all these agencies writing the regulations. They litigate and punish, and the whole works. And it just continues no matter what, whether we're in session or not. Which means that if we are ever to get the control of this system back again, it has to be getting control of the Congress, because at least you get a crack at the members of the House every 2 years. And fortunately, we might see some turnovers this year.